The historical process of the colonization of North America is a fascinating phenomenon because it is surrounded by many mysteries and myths that cannot be solved without some alcohol. How to explain the fact that in popular culture the first pilgrim colonists were presented almost as saints, despite the fact that America was already inhabited by Indians who mysteriously disappeared? How did the colonization of the United States actually take place, and which colony was the first? In the next few minutes, we will go to the legendary ship Mayflower, the crew of which founded the first major settlement in the territory of the modern United States. The traditional guest, Mason Green, will help us with this. The date of our voyage is November 21st, 1620, when Mason and 101 other English residents have just weighed anchor off Cape Cod in Massachusetts. It was these people on the Mayflower who became known as the Pilgrim Fathers, and according to research, 1 in 20 people in the United States now has an ancestor from among that 100. They founded a colony in Plymouth, which is considered the first major settlement with a permanent population, although in fact the championship belongs to Jamestown, founded by the British back in 1607. However, Jamestown was small and could not boast of permanence. It was the Mayflower that became the real anchor of the British in North America, and its first inhabitants are still considered gods, although they ended up there by accident. Let's start with a story about who our Mason is and how he got to America. It all started with religious conflicts, which were typical for that time. An interesting situation arose in England. On the one hand, the official English church looked in the direction of Catholicism and sought to change the British faith. On the other hand, there were Protestants, some of whom received the support of the established church, while the other part broke away and became known as Puritans or Independents. In simple words, these people became religious dissidents, held their meetings and criticized the established church, which, of course, did not like the main church, and she tried to prevent them as best she could. As a result, a small number of the most determined Puritan dissidents fled to Holland. They lived there for about 10 years, and their community grew to 300 people. But even there, the British missed their homeland and could not find a place for themselves. Some of them began to drink. Some merged with the Dutch population, and some returned to their homeland, eventually finding themselves under the protection of Pastor John Robertson, who offered an elegant solution: to go to North America to start a new life. Robertson sent William Bradford and a small group of Puritans to England in search of funding. They found support from the Virginia Company, which was engaged in a settlement founded in 1607 in Jamestown. Funding was secured and 2 ships, Speedwell and Mayflower, were ready to ship. However, the Speedwell proved unsuitable for long-distance travel, and they had to use only the Mayflower. The Virginia Company demanded a simple condition from the Puritans: to work off the money allocated to them on new lands. So, our Mason, running away from the church, was on the ship among the 102 colonists, and the course was set for Jamestown in Virginia. However, due to storms, they ended up much further north, in Plymouth. And during the 2-month voyage, 2 people died, and 1 was born. After realizing that there was no help on land, the colonists at a general meeting made a decision that turned out to be crucial for the future of the United States. They canceled the contract with the Virginia Company, citing an error in the course and the inability to earn money in Jamestown. They also signed the so-called Mayflower Treaty, agreeing to create their own colony with blackjack and girls of easy virtue. This agreement fixed the basic laws and principles by which the new city would live. John Carver was elected governor of the colony. Some sources consider this treaty to be the first democratic constitution, since all decisions were made by all members by general vote. However, it is worth noting that only men had the right to vote. But this was already a matter later, after a stormy booze. A happy ending for our Mason meant that apart from a beautiful treaty, the travel-weary colonists had nothing, including land. After all, they were on the ship, and they made their first sorties only a couple of weeks later. They discovered an abandoned Indian settlement, and the first thing the colonists did was occupy bean and corn seeds. Although they promised to reimburse the tribe in writing later, this moment in U.S. history is considered almost divine, because without these seeds, the future of the colony would look bright but brief. About a month later, Mason and the rest of the team limited themselves to such brief sorties, and in December they first encountered aggressive Indians. Some of the colonists had firearms and managed to repel the aggression of the Indians. At that time, they also found an abandoned settlement, where it turned out that a few years ago this tribe was destroyed by an epidemic, and the survivors left in a panic. However, their attacks on the colonists continued, because a couple of years before that, an English ship with the military sailed in the same area, which captured several dozen Indians as slaves. Among them was an Indian named Squanto, who returned and became an ally of the Pilgrims, providing them with invaluable assistance. First, Squanto learned English during his captivity and acted as an intermediary, explaining to the Indians that the colonists did not intend to fight. Secondly, he knew the area well and helped the colonists grow food and settle down on local land. One of the colonists in his diaries described the Indians as a godsend helper. By January, the settlers had already built their first houses, but mostly still lived on the ship. They faced scurvy and other diseases due to harsh conditions and cold. Of the 102 people, only 47 survived the first winter. There was even a moment when only 5 people could take care of others, and the rest were too weak to help. The British even deliberately threw grass on the graves so that the Indians would not notice how weakened their settlement was, and so as not to spread rumors about the ineffectiveness of their magic firearms. However, thanks to corn and the help of an Indian, the surviving colonists were able to provide themselves with food and survive the next winter in comfort. To commemorate this event, Governor William Bradford proclaimed a holiday of thanksgiving to God, known to this day as Thanksgiving Day. The people of the United States thank God for what they have, in keeping with the legacy of the Pilgrim Fathers who miraculously survived. It was from this moment that the slow but sure colonization of America began. News of the colony's success spread throughout the Old World, and the British began to encourage those wishing to travel to the new continent in search of another life. In the early years of colonization, the situation was relatively peaceful. Our Mason and other colonists concluded peace treaties with the Indian tribes, who, seeing the deplorable situation of the Pilgrims, did not particularly touch them and even helped them settle down on the new continent. The results of this interaction are well known. The strength of the British, French, and Spanish in America was growing. They combined diplomacy with forceful methods, using insane cunning and inhuman cruelty. For example, in Pennsylvania, some treaties with the Indians for the transfer of territory were concluded on the principle of calculating distances in days of travel on foot. Then the British built roads and hired specially trained runners who, during the day, covered twice the territory than the Indians expected. But an agreement is an agreement, and the territory passed into the possession of the colonialists. It is important to remember that, in most cases, the first settlers on the continent did not come from wealthy sections of the population. After all, even the male colony was actually founded by dissidents fleeing the church, and it is foolish to believe that they were later joined by angels in search of adventure. Most often these were bankrupt people, criminals, non-believers, and just daredevils. That is, not the most peaceful segments of the population. The new life forced these people to change beyond recognition. It is worth noting another curious fact. Initially, the native countries did not treat the first settlers very well, because they fled from there. However, the British Crown and other European powers quickly saw the conquest of the territory as a profitable source of income and began to help the settlers with finances, weapons, and other forms of support. But we should not forget that the settlers initially treated the idea of state control extremely negatively. The guys from Plymouth, for example, consistently followed their contract and not some laws of the country, which was 2 months away across the ocean. Nevertheless, money still played its role, and the British, like representatives of other countries, began to consider the settlement their territory. We all know that this later led to the United States War of Independence. It is important to remember that independence is not an idea invented by revolutionaries in 1775. It is a direct continuation of the philosophy of the Pilgrim Fathers, including our Mason Green, who sailed to America to become independent. Not just for a century and a half, this idea was eclipsed by capital and the armies that constantly arrived on the continent. However, perhaps the saddest thing in all of history is the fate of the Indians, who were soldered, deceived, poisoned, and shot, and also turned into slaves at every turn. It is important to note that it was the Indians who helped the first full-fledged colony avoid death, and in general, the attitude of the settlers towards the Indians was positive.